families will have their lives upended because of Donald Trump's actions.
Get over it. I hope these January 6th defendants move on with their lives.
I think this DEI leave is just another example of kind of cruelty and pettiness.
The American people don't think about race or gender nearly as much as some folks in Washington want to pretend. They think more about merit.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, consequential moves on immigration. As you are well aware, President Trump has signed numerous executive orders dealing with immigration and illegal immigration. One of them deals with expanding the use of the U.S. military. We have fresh reporting, which we'll get to in just a few moments, about the details of that military deployment, what they will or will not be doing, plus new reporting on orders just given to the Border Patrol about those they interdict at the southern border. All that's coming up in a few minutes. In addition to that, ditching diversity. President Trump has abruptly ended initiatives that aim to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion inside the federal government.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates all across the government and private sector in return our country to the merit system, you know?
Plus, something interesting occurs on the Silk Road. The president has kept a campaign pledge to pardon the gentleman you see there, Ross Ulbricht. More on the man behind Silk Road, an infamous dark web marketplace that traded in, among other things, drugs, guns, and other illegal services. Scott McFarland, Ed O'Keefe, and Camila Montoya Galvez are following all the things I just outlined. Let's start tonight with Scott on Capitol Hill and Ed at the White House. Scott, lots of things happening on Capitol Hill, including fallout continuing from the broad, sweeping January 6 pardons issued by President Trump and someone who visited the Capitol again today.
The Oath Keepers founder, Stuart Rhodes, who was released from prison about 24 hours ago, about 10 years ahead of schedule with his pardon or commutation, was at the Longworth House Office Building right here on Capitol Hill, spotted at a Dunkin' Donuts, and had a long, extended gaggle with reporters who congregated around him. Stuart Rhodes was convicted of seditious conspiracy, the highest level charge of any of the January 6 defendants. Seditious conspiracy is a legal way of saying conspiring to overthrow the government. He'd been held in the Cumberland, Maryland federal prison for quite some time now, but fresh off his release, he was here. He told reporters, Major, to talk to legislators about the prisoner releases. The offers of tours have been made by some of Trump's Republican House allies to other January 6 defendants now that they're free from prison. But I can tell you right now, we speak regularly with the victims of January 6, the injured police officers, the barricaded congressional staffers. They do not like the idea of seeing the rioters, the conspirators, and the defendants here on Capitol grounds.
Ed, going to you at the White House. In a previous life, you paid very close attention at the Washington Post to the federal workforce. The Trump administration has taken executive action against diversity, equity, inclusion, and other aspects of how you work or may not in the future work within the federal workforce. Summarize for us.
Yeah, well, at this hour, there are an untold number of people across the federal workforce being placed on paid leave and having their emails shut off as the agencies and departments now under the control of President Trump reassess those programs, diversity, equity, inclusion programs that deal with race, gender, and socioeconomic status. A memo sent out late last night to agency heads made clear they had until today to do this at 5 p.m. And it essentially ends Biden-era instructions to make sure that these types of concerns about representation of gender, of race, of socioeconomic status were factored into hiring decisions and general agency practices. And so it is fulfilling a campaign pledge. It now, as I said, places an untold number of people on paid leave, either permanently in that they'll be laid off or perhaps temporarily, as then it can be shown that this was just one piece of the broader work they do and whatever it is they do. There is no one-size-fits-all policy for the federal government, because what goes on at the National Park Service is not what goes on at the Voice of America or the Commerce Department or the Interior Department. But all instructions given out when it comes to personnel says to these places, hey, start enacting these policies, or in the case of Trump now, pull it back. And so it's the first signal of how he's trying to dramatically reshape government management, which he started to do with executive orders he signed on Monday night. And it's one that's frankly going to take weeks, if not months, to fully suss out as these agencies determine who exactly was doing this kind of work and how are we going to end those programs. Notable that at least tonight at the Department of Homeland Security, employees are being told, we know, they claim to have evidence that some of those that were doing this kind of work have gone about renaming their jobs or their programs or their titles in recent days or weeks to avoid this. And that if you have evidence of this, come forward, please, and tell us. That starts to create some really potentially ugly office dynamics. And this is the kind of stuff that lawmakers, the labor unions that represent these people, and civil rights organizations will be on the lookout for. We'd love to see the proof that they allegedly have of this. Burrowing in, as that's called, where you are someone who was put in place during the last administration and you find a way to stay behind, not necessarily to flout the work of the current president, but just frankly to have a job, is common, has happened before. This is a pretty egregious accusation to make, though, with no proof that we're aware of, at least so far.
Scott McFarland on Capitol Hill, Ed O'Keefe on the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you very much. I want to turn now to Camila Montoya Galvez to talk about the new reporting you have on deployment of the U.S. military toward the southern border, the numbers we know so far, how large those numbers could be, and what activities they are likely to undertake. Camilo?
What we know so far, Major, is that the Trump administration today directed the Department of Defense to deploy at least 1,500 active duty troops to the U.S.-Mexico border to support U.S. Customs and Border Protection in an operational capacity. That is on top of the 2,500 troops that had already been stationed there at the U.S.-Mexico border under federal orders, because, of course, states like Texas have their own National Guard soldiers there to fortify the border with razor wire and other barriers. They are supposed to be providing only logistical and operational support because of longstanding legal limits that prevent the military from being used in domestic law enforcement, including the enforcement of federal immigration laws. We also understand that, according to one memo we obtained, the administration is planning to send as many as 10,000 overall troops to the border. So the numbers could increase in the coming weeks and months. And the Department of Defense, according to this memo, Major, is also importantly considering to use Department of Defense bases and military installations to hold immigrants awaiting deportation. That would be a seismic shift in policy, because typically that has been the responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security.
And also, Camila, you have new reporting on orders, fresh orders given to Border Patrol agents at the border.
That's right. On Monday, soon after taking office, President Trump invoked sweeping presidential powers and powers in the Constitution to essentially seal U.S. borders to migrants and asylum seekers who lack proper documents to come here, and to suspend their entry indefinitely. He accused them of orchestrating an invasion of the U.S. and of potentially posing a national security or public health threat to the country. And so, in accordance to those directives, now we have been told that Border Patrol has been issued guidance and directives to basically summarily and swiftly deport all migrants who are entering the country unlawfully back to Mexico or to their home countries, importantly, without affording them the chance and opportunity to request asylum, which traditionally has been an obligation under domestic and international refugee law.
Significant applications of immigration policy that may run up against precedential American law. Camila Montoya Galvez, thank you very much for your reporting. We are also following a school shooting that occurred in Tennessee. One student is dead and another wounded after a third student opened fire inside a high school in Nashville. Police say the person killed was a 16-year-old female student. They have identified the shooter as a 17-year-old male. Authorities say the gunman is also dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. This shooting took place in the high school's cafeteria. CBS News 24/7 will bring more updates as they become available. Ross Ulbricht ran an online black market known as Silk Road. It sold drugs and much, much more. Why President Trump has just granted him a pardon. That's next. You are watching America Decides.
And if you vote for me on day one, I will commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht. He's already served 11 years. We're going to get him home.
That was then candidate Donald Trump making a campaign promise at the Libertarian Party National Convention to pardon Silk Road founder Ross Ulbricht. In 2011, Ulbricht set up his website on the dark web. It was called Silk Road. It became a hub for people to sell lots of things, among them drugs, weapons, and, believe it or not, murder-for-hire services. Now, Ulbricht didn't do any of those things. He just provided the place on the web in which those transactions, often or almost exclusively paid for in cryptocurrency, could be transacted. In 2015, he received 2 life sentences, which many in that Libertarian Party convention you just saw thought was excessive. The FBI once referred to Silk Road as, quote, the most sophisticated and extensive criminal marketplace on the internet. Technology reporter David Yaffe-Bellany is covering Ulbricht for the New York Times and joins us now. David, it's great to have you with us. For those who are just catching on to this story, had never really heard anything about Silk Road or Ross Ulbricht, paint a picture for us.
Sure. So Ross Ulbricht was a kind of crucial figure in the early history of cryptocurrencies. He created this platform where people could buy and sell drugs. You could have drugs basically sent to you via the postal system, and you would pay for it in Bitcoin, which would keep those transactions anonymous. Eventually, he was caught and ended up with that double life sentence that you alluded to before.
And did this website and Ulbricht's involvement make him something akin to a folk hero among libertarians or libertarian-inclined ideologues in this country?
Yes, absolutely. Ross was a libertarian himself. He espoused libertarian ideals, and the project of the Silk Road sort of corresponded with some of the ideas of the movement. And so he was embraced by libertarians, especially when he received a sentence that even many kind of neutral legal experts considered unusually harsh for what he did.
And what did he actually do that led to this sentencing?
So what he was charged with doing was creating this platform where drugs were distributed over the internet. And there were some other charges as well. There were also accusations that he solicited people to commit murders on his behalf. He was never actually charged with that, though it did affect his sentence. And there's no evidence that those murders were actually committed. But that aspect of his behavior certainly had a major contribution on his public reputation and the sentence that he ultimately received.
And I know libertarians believe, hey, look, if people want to take drugs, it's their right. But there were some significant harms that arose from transactions, drug transactions on Silk Road, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, the federal prosecutors attributed 6 deaths to drugs that were sold on Silk Road. You had parents of those people, speaking during the court proceedings about the effect that Silk Road had on their lives. I mean, he's a man who committed very serious crimes. There's no question about it.
And what do you think this tells us, this pardon, about maybe the political popularity of Ross Ulbricht or the libertarian movement, or is it more about an association from this new president returning to office and cryptocurrency itself?
I think it offers some major insights into how Trump operates. If you can get close to him, you can advocate for this sort of stuff. So in his announcement that he was issuing this pardon, he sort of thanked the libertarians for voting for him. So clearly it was a gesture to that movement. And, this is something he promised to do on the campaign trail when he spoke at a Bitcoin conference and was trying to appeal to that constituency as well. So it's a reflection of kind of 2 groups that he's sort of allied himself with, during his latest rise to power.
David Yaffe-Bellany, The New York Times, thank you so very much. Senate Republicans have been, quote, full steam ahead on President Trump's cabinet picks. So when will RFK Jr.'s Health and Services confirmation hearing actually happen? More on that next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for staying with us. Health and Human Services Secretary nominee Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is set to appear before senators on Capitol Hill exactly 1 week from today. This, I don't need to tell you, is a highly anticipated confirmation and hearing, in part because the former presidential candidate's well-documented history of spreading false and misleading claims about vaccines. Julie Rovner joins me now. She is chief Washington correspondent for KFF Health News. She also hosts its weekly healthcare policy news podcast, cleverly titled, What the Health? Julie, it's always great to see you. So we have a hearing date now, which we didn't until just a couple of hours ago. Where would you say, and explain to our audience, the status of RFK Jr.'s nomination stands?
I would still say it's troubled, and it's mostly because he has opposition coming from various different directions. There are still
not just Democratic.
No, not just Democratic. There are members of the anti-abortion movement that are very unhappy because until he pretty much took this position as the candidate, he'd been pro-abortion rights. So for most of his life, most of his career. So there are still anti-abortion groups that are extremely worried about him. There are, as you mentioned, public health groups that don't like his position on vaccines and some other some of the other issues. We don't know many of his positions on a lot of the things that the Department of Health and Human Services oversees, like Medicare and Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, big things with big dollar signs attached to them.
Now, as I understand it, as RFK Jr. has, as every cabinet nominee secretary does, makes the rounds, has been doing quite a substantial reversal on his previously repetitive skepticism, if not outright hostility to vaccines.
Yes, he has tried to describe himself as someone who just wants to see more information about vaccines. Of course, there's voluminous information. They've been studied over many years, most vaccines, particularly childhood vaccines, over decades. And they are known to be extremely safe, extremely effective. Yes, there are people who have side effects from vaccines. That's why there are programs to help people who have side effects from the vaccines. But overall, it is considered an enormous boon to public health. It's really a very small minority led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who still, has concerns about vaccine safety, childhood vaccine safety.
And Julie, one other thing on RFK Jr. As I've traveled the Hill, I've talked to senators of both parties who are enthusiastic about some of the skepticism that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has expressed about oils, processed sugars, and the way the U.S. Agriculture Department would not be in his purview, deals with food and related issues that are subsidized either by the government or are part of food programs for those less fortunate in our country.
Yeah, there are a lot of Democrats who support a lot of what he's been saying about ultra-processed food and, again, about, certain additives that go into foods. The Biden administration, on its way out the door, issued a ban on red dye number 3, which is something that RFK Jr. has been talking about for quite a long time, so sort of getting ahead of it. So you have this sort of interesting mix of people who support a lot of what he does, oppose a lot of what he does, and they're coming from all sides. So it really is a big question mark what's going to happen with this nomination.
Julie, I also want to ask you about something that is reported to be a new move from the incoming Trump administration to limit or halt communication to the public from public health entities within the federal government. Can you describe what you have learned?
Yeah, this is not that unusual that when a new administration comes in, even one of the same party, but certainly one of a different party, that they just say to all the public affairs offices, stop, don't put out any press releases, any changes in guidance, any certainly not any regulations. But this seems to go further than most administrations have done. They're going to do things like stop the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which is a scientific publication that the CDC puts out every week. Apparently, it's only going to go through the end of the month, but this does seem to be a bit more dramatic than the usual, just wait until we have our people in place so we can coordinate things.
And it does create an atmosphere that perhaps the information that you might have otherwise been delivered is not necessarily as trustworthy, and they want to have their own brand on the information communicated from the federal health officials. Julie Robner, always great to see you. Thanks so much. I hope you'll come back.
Sure.
What is pardoning literally hundreds of criminals who attack police officers have to do with bringing grocery prices down?
Democrats on Capitol Hill say President Trump's priorities are wrong when it comes to pardoning the January 6th defendants. So, what is the reaction from top Republicans? Our reporter panel will dig into that and much more. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The House of Representatives moments ago passed the Lincoln-Riley Act. This will expand federal authorities and powers to detain those undocumented immigrants suspected of any manner of crimes committed in this country. The vote was 263 to 156. We discussed this earlier with Scott McFarland. He suggested there might be some number of House Democrats to join on to this legislation. That number, in the end, 46 House Democrats voted in favor of the Lincoln-Riley Act. This bill now heads to President Trump for his signature, which will be forthcoming in a matter of days and be the first piece of legislation signed in Trump 2.0. Meanwhile, Speaker Mike Johnson defending President Trump's broad grant of clemency to the January 6th rioters. We want to show you what Johnson said alongside what actually happened just over 4 years ago.
Everybody can describe this however they want. The president has the pardon and commutation authority. It's his decision, and I think what was made clear all along is that peaceful protests and people who engage in that should never be punished. There was a weaponization of the Justice Department.
Well, Molly Ball and Shelby Talcott are here with me now at the table. Molly is senior political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Shelby, White House correspondent for Semaphore. So, very quickly, Molly, the Lincoln-Riley Act, there will be a signing ceremony at the White House. Senate Democrats did not allow this to come to the floor before the election. They did this time. They amended it slightly, but it's on its way to President Trump's desk.
Elections have consequences.
Indeed, they do.
And it's very clear. I mean, we reported today on a letter that many of the Democrats in the Senate sent to Republican leadership saying they want to continue to work together on immigration. There's a clear sense that Democrats have gotten the message from the electorate that they want something done on immigration. That being said, there's still quite a lot of unease within the Democratic caucus about how far to go, given that, you know, something like this started as a messaging bill and has a lot of provisions that Democrats remain uneasy with. So, and I think they're all waiting to see what the Trump administration does on the executive level with immigration, how far they go, and whether there's any kind of public backlash to it.
And Shelby, the administration is going quite a distance toward overhauling not only the application of immigration laws, but the very definition of what it means to seek asylum in this country, to arrive at our gates as a refugee or seeking refugee status, and the deployment of the U.S. military.
Yeah, and I think this is a situation where they're most certainly going to see legal pushback on a variety of these executive orders that we've seen drop in the last day and a half. But this is what Donald Trump campaigned on. He campaigned on the economy and on immigration. Those were his two top issues, and he made pretty clear what he was going to do on day one. And throughout the past few months, when I've talked to transition officials, they've made very clear that this has been their goal. And so I think particularly when it comes to immigration, this has been no secret that this is what Donald Trump wants to do. He's gone into office, and he's doing exactly what he said he was going to.
And Molly, just to put a legal button on this, it is the assumption of the Trump administration it will fight these legal battles, and it wants some of them to get to the Supreme Court because it believes it will get a favorable interpretation.
That's right, and we'll see. I mean, many of the
That's
things
their assumption. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but that's their initial assumption.
Or at the very least that they win politically from the fight, from, as Shelby said, appearing to be pushing as hard as possible to make good on those campaign promises to the fullest extent that they possibly can. Now, many of the things that Trump tried to do on immigration in his first term were stopped in the courts, and we don't see any let up in, you know, the willingness of outside organizations to bring lawsuits against these types of actions. So, you know, is the Supreme Court majority now more favorable to Donald Trump when it comes to something where there's a great deal of precedent, like, say, the attempt to overturn birthright citizenship? We'll have to see, because that is something on which the courts have been quite consistent for a very long time.
Shelby, also moves by the Trump administration to overhaul, if it can, certainly reimagine the size, scope of the federal workforce, specifically as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, they have signed an executive order getting rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they actually sent agency heads last night a letter saying, here's a sample of what you should be sending out to these people who have these jobs. We're getting rid of these jobs. And they've also initiated a warning saying if any of these agencies are trying to sort of get DEI to remain under a different name, you have to tell us. So there's a lot going on with that. But again, this is another thing that Donald Trump campaigned on. And I think, you know, in the past day and a half, what we've learned is what Donald Trump has campaigned on is what he is doing in the first few days of his administration. Everything he said he was going to do, pardon the January 6 rioters, get rid of DEI, try to shrink the scope of the government. He's trying to do all of that.
Molly, you wrote vividly, as you so often do, about the inauguration inside the Capitol Rotunda. The arrangement of billionaires, tech and otherwise, right next to the rostrum. And yet, there was an announcement at the White House yesterday about Stargate, supposedly $500 billion to be invested in data centers and the power required to fuel them, to move artificial intelligence development way forward in this country. Mere hours later, Elon Musk throws cold water all over that on X, saying they don't have the money, they don't have the resources. And that seems to me a kind of dividing line.
We're already seeing,
worth looking at.
Yeah, we're already seeing tensions break out over Elon Musk's role and exactly what it is he's empowered to do. If all he's doing is taking pot shots on social media and he's not, using governmental authority.
And raining on a presidential parade.
Sure, but he didn't have the power, for example, to stop that announcement from being made or to undo it in any material way that we have seen so far. He's expressing skepticism about it essentially as a private citizen. So as much as there are tensions, within the White House and in the larger Trump movement over the things Elon wants to do, and some suspicion about to what extent he may have vested interests at stake as well, given that he himself has an AI company. I think a lot is going to depend. And a long-standing rivalry
with Sam Altman, who was in the Roosevelt Room last evening.
Exactly, and with many of those other tech billionaires who were in the rotunda for the swearing in. So I think a lot is going to depend on what he can actually do versus what he's just out there popping off about.
And Shelby, this also factors in and filters through the Department of Government Efficiency, which is now within the Eisenhower Executive Office building, right across the street from the White House, occupying what used to be the U.S. Digital Services bureaucracy, which means it's actually a real thing. It's got an office, it's got staff, and it's going to be run entirely by Elon. Vivek Ramaswamy on the way out.
And this was really interesting because they were able to, this is how they were able to sort of do this by essentially taking this existing agency and just putting a new name on it. But what's really notable is we have a lot of questions that remain when it comes to DOGE because the executive order really focused on expanding and improving the technology of the government, whereas the initial mission of DOGE, of course, was to drastically save money and shrink the U.S. government. And then you have Elon Musk, who has a room in the White House, who has a building, an office space there, but he's not actually a White House official. And so there are a lot of questions that remain on how this is going to work and what exactly DOGE is going to ultimately be responsible for doing.
And what somebody like Elon Musk might learn about very extensive access to the inner workings of the federal technology apparatus.
Yes.
He could use that in all sorts of ways, maybe to help the U.S. taxpayer, maybe to help Elon Musk and his widespread industrial technological footprint.
Yep. And I will say a quick way, though, to get out of Donald Trump's favor is to do something like tweet about an initiative that Donald Trump has been touting and sort of pour cold water on it. And, who knows if Donald Trump will take that seriously. But generally, historically, that's not the smartest thing to do. But we'll see.
That saying goes, watch this space. Shelby Talcott, Molly Ball, thanks so much as always. More than 20 states, 22 is the exact number, have sued the Trump administration over the president's order, which is an attempt to end birthright citizenship. I spoke with Democratic Attorneys General of Michigan, New Jersey, and Nevada before inauguration about Trump's pledge to do this very thing.
I wouldn't consider us the resistance. What we are individuals who believe in the rule of law, and as long as the rule of law is followed, we're fine. But the moment the rule of law is violated, we will be there to defend it.
These attorneys general say they are not spoiling for a fight with the new Trump administration, but they see the threat of mass deportations as an early flashpoint.
I think it's one thing to think about it in theory. It's another thing to see how it's implemented in practice. And I think there are going to be a lot of Trump voters that are sort of in for a rude awakening when they see what it actually looks like.
Trump officials have said family separation and large deportation camps could be part of its mass deportation push.
We have a large population of immigrants in our state, and every Nevadan has constitutional rights. And to the extent these policies violate constitutional rights of people in my state, I will stand against that.
Add to that Mr. Trump's challenge to birthright citizenship protections historically upheld by federal courts.
Going after birthright citizenship, going after American kids of people who have been here, who've committed no crimes. Those are Americans in many cases. Birthright citizenship is in the Constitution. If that's what he decides to do, then yes, we're prepared to stand up to that.
It's likely that our states are going to become less safe. Our communities may become less safe because we're not going after violent criminals, because that attention is going to be diverted towards going towards people who are not violent offenders.
Democratic AGs sued President Trump more than 150 times during his first term. They've been preparing and coordinating legal defenses for his second term for nearly a year.
Elections have consequences, and we all acknowledge that.
Presidents win elections, they are not kings. We took an oath, each one of us, to uphold the Constitution of our states and the Constitution of this country. And that's what we're going to do.
And if the president-elect says, as he very well might, I'll see you at the Supreme Court and I'll probably win.
I get the reality. I understand the reality. Am I disappointed in some of the decisions that the Supreme Court has come out with over the course of years? Sure. But I also believe that we have to continue to arbitrate these in our judicial system.
From Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller in the early 20th century to Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Musk today, why some experts and historians believe we just might be living in a second Gilded Age. More on that next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Great to have you with us. The start of President Trump's second term, the rapidly developing tech space is drawing parallels in the minds of some to the Gilded Age. That term, Gilded Age, coined by Mark Twain in a very famous novel. It refers to a period of time from the late 19th to early 20th century where the United States saw, among other things, rapid industrialization, economic growth, and those things intertwined with political corruption and wealth inequality. H.W. Brands joins me now. He is a historian and author of several books, including a great one, American Colossus, The Triumph of Capitalism, 1865 to 1900. Bill, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Is this a second Gilded Age in American history?
It is a second Gilded Age. There are a lot of similarities. So there's rapidly changing technology. There's a growth in wealth inequality and the emergence of a class of extremely rich people. There are some differences, though. And the differences reflect a couple of things. One is that the government of the United States is very much larger today than it was back then. So there was very much less interest on the part of the oligarchs of the day to lobby government. They weren't looking for government contracts the way the oligarchs today are. And political influence was concentrated in Congress then rather than in the executive. So there was nothing like what we saw on Inauguration Day, where there are several of the wealthiest men in America lined up right behind the president while he's taking his inaugural oath. There was nothing like that. If anything, they would have focused their efforts on the Senate, especially, and the House of Representatives.
I want to play you something from that inaugural address that President Trump gave inside the Capitol Rotunda using the words manifest destiny. Tech, please play that.
The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars.
Expansionism, that's a long-running American theme. Not quite Mars, but that's a new component of it. But the idea of an endlessly expanding America, that is part of Gilded Age sensibilities, is it not?
So the term manifest destiny originated before the Civil War, at the time of the greatest territorial expansion. Now, America's territorial expansion largely stopped by the beginning of the Gilded Age with the purchase of Alaska in 1867. It focused on other things. And for Donald Trump to revive it and speak of taking America's manifest destiny to the stars, that's mighty ambitious. And he's sort of speaking not only for the United States apparently here, but he's speaking presumably for the human race in heading into outer space.
And Bill, it's also something that occurs to me comparing these two times. The Gilded Age not only had all the economics we've talked about, the technology, industrialization, but it was disruptive to people's sense of where they stood in relation to the economy that they once knew, where they stood in relationship to politics. That's very consistent with the way people feel now.
That's definitely true. So the Gilded Age brought in rapid changes in technology, the urbanization of America, for example, in the first Gilded Age of the late 19th century. More and more people were living in cities, and cities seemed to very many Americans to be almost foreign places, including the fact that they were occupied by increasing numbers of foreign immigrants. So there's that aspect. Now, there's another striking difference, and that is that America's first populist party, so-called, emerged during the Gilded Age. But it was a populist party that was railing against the billionaires. Now, populists, American populism, such as it is, elected a billionaire president. And this billionaire president is in league with the other billionaires. So populism seemed to be anti the new wealthy class back then. If anything, it seems to be in favor of the new wealthy class today.
Here's another point of contrast I'd like you to evaluate, Bill. So the answer to what were perceived politically as the ravages or the excesses of the Gilded Age was progressivism, and a sense that there needed to be a strong federal civil service, no patronage, experts marshaling the forces of expertise to make for a better government, federal and state. The answer to it now is no, no, no. That's all gotten too big. It needs to be dismantled. Maybe things thrown back to the state, or maybe dismantled entirely. That seems to me to be a rather substantial contrast.
It is a contrast if we think of the Gilded Age, let's say, circa 1890, before populism really took hold, before the progressive movement matured. So who knows what politics in the United States is going to look like 10 years from now? Maybe Donald Trump will bring in a new era of progressivism when Americans realize, oh, you know, there's stuff the government did for us that we kind of liked. Let's bring that back instead of dismantling it.
What about this idea of renaming Mount McKinley, calling the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, and relitigating the Panama Canal?
Well, the Panama Canal issue is one that will really throw the United States right back into that era if the government of the United States follows through, because it was during the Gilded Age under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt that the United States wrested control of the Panama Canal from Panama, which was wrested from Colombia, the country from which it seceded. And it was the high age of imperialism. There's a big difference here, that in the 1890s, in the early 1900s, it was sort of accepted that powerful countries, European powers, the United States, would seize colonies. And that's kind of the way it was. If the United States reverted to that form now, it would go counter to what the vast consensus of thinking in the world is. Europe gave up its colonies. You know, colonies are gone, and now President Trump is talking about creating the equivalent of that again. It would certainly erode America's ability to criticize Russia and Ukraine for trying to take back territory that Russia once thought was his. It would erode America's ability to criticize China for trying to gain control of Taiwan. That is really going to be a stretch to pull that one off.
A stretch indeed. H.W. Brands, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
My pleasure.
On Friday, President Trump will visit communities ravaged by wildfires in Southern California. More on that and the new blaze that is rapidly expanding this evening. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. We are monitoring the rapidly expanding Hughes fire in Los Angeles County. At least 5,000 acres have been burned, and additional mandatory evacuations have been ordered. President Trump is set to visit communities burned by fires earlier this month, doing so on Friday. To talk about what actually is important about these wildfires, I want to bring in investigative reporter for the Los Angeles Times, Eileen Chekmedia. Eileen, it's great to talk to you. You and your colleagues at the LA Times have done some really important reporting about decisions not taken before these wildfires broke out that had been taken in previous instances in Los Angeles when the combination of drought, dry brush, and high winds were present. Explain to my audience what you found.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So we obtained some internal documents that show the resources that the LA Fire Department had available and what they chose to staff up and pre-position in fire risk areas in the city of LA ahead of the fire. These were decisions that were made at a day before the fire ignited in the Pacific Palisades. This was when the National Weather Service was sending out pretty dramatic warnings about a life-threatening and destructive windstorm that was on the way to the region. And we found that the LAFD had a set of more than 40 available engines that could have helped them with wildfire threats in response, and they only chose to staff about 5 of them ahead of the fire. They also have, or they're supposed to have, 9 or so more engines in reserve. These are supposed to be fully loaded engines that can send out immediately in an emergency or if another rig breaks down. And on the planning documents that we obtained, the LAFD also said no to deploying these extra engines. To compare, we looked at similarly bad wind events in the past, including one in 2011, which actually the Weather Service was using this time around when alerting fire officials about what to expect on January 7th. They were saying to expect conditions as bad or worse than this event in 2011. And when we examined what they did back then, the differences were stark. They staffed up a lot more and pre-positioned a lot more resources in more areas, including in the Pacific Palisades, where this fire happened.
And Eileen, explain to the audience the vital importance of this pre-positioning. Having firefighters there in case something happens to respond rapidly. Why does that matter so much?
Pretty much the experts that we spoke to said in these types of events, being fast is key because fires start really small, and the key is to get there as quickly as possible and hit it fast and hit it hard, right? And so if you were pre-deployed in certain areas, you would be able to get there as fast as possible and throw everything at it from the outset and then get it under control quickly before it spreads rapidly, especially on a day like this when the winds were blowing 80, 90, 100 miles per hour. That has the potential to be very damaging.
And lots of people have heard plenty of information, some disinformation about fire hydrants. But as I understand it, if those fires are not jumped on immediately and they begin to get velocity, begin to get size and scope, then residents understandably begin to use their own hoses to try to wet down their houses, pulling water out of the available fire hydrants, making the response, late though it is, for firefighters, all the more difficult. Do I have that right?
Yeah, there were some pressure issues with the fire hydrants because of just the demand that was happening with just how much water they needed to use. And my colleagues have done great work on that, and also looking at the empty reservoir that was built that was nearby that didn't have any water in it as well.
Eileen Chekmedia, the LA Times, thank you very much for your reporting and your time. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.